when did you join Trinity House?
On the 2nd of January 1934.
And when did you leave?
In April 1946. Yes. And during that those 12 years, I was 3 years as a supernumerary. So it meant my first appointment was to the Nab, and I was there from 1937 until I was pensioned off in 1946, which I was there right through the war.
Can you go back first to when you joined?
Yes.
Where did you go to train?
I did from January the 2nd until March. Equal time at the workshops at Blackwall and the experimental room at Trinity House.
Can you tell us what the training consisted of?
Yes, at Blackwall I spent time in the carpenter shop, which we had training in using ordinary things like using a set square and making a simple box, or joining up two pieces of wood. That was in the carpenter shop. In the tinsmith shop, we made, or were taught to use tin snips and cut metal up, and our test was making a collar box, because in those days, in the early days, you used to wear stiff collars. They were modern then, and the tin box was like the shape of like a biscuit tin, like a round biscuit tin. But we had to actually make, and I made it, and I suppose it passed muster, and got the certificate for that. And then when we went to Trinity House, I've forgotten who the instructor was. The instructor,
So Mr. Reese.
yeah, I think that was his name, and he taught us the all about the IOBs, the incandescent oil burners, and the semaphore, and the Morse with a little episode that happened when the instructor was telling us about how the oil was converted to vapor and so on. He spent a lot of time explaining that. And by the way, there was about half a dozen of us supers being instructed. And at the end of it all, the instructor said, "Are there any questions?" And one of the supers said, "Is it electric?" And of course that caused commotion for a while. And it was all sorted out. Realised afterwards it was a joke, and that was it.
At least you hope it was a joke.
Yeah, that was my. And of course, during the stay at Trinity House, I remember there were slack times, and we were sent out on messages. I remember one occasion having to go to one of the ministries with samples of, I don't know where it was, some government department, and by doing that, I remember I was told that after I delivered that I could go on home, which was saved an hour or so. But of course, we lodged, or I lodged, at Plasdow with Mrs. Rippon, commonly known as Ma Rippon, and she was the widow of a lightship master, and well, she must have been at that time must have been in her 60s, because she had a son, Ernie Rippon. He became a lighthouse keeper, and he would have been, although I never met him, but he was in the service at the same time as me.
Now you say, was it your first lighthouse was the Nab?
I only had one appointment, and that was on the Nab in 1937, and I got knowledge of my appointment. I was doing duty at Bull Point, and I've still got the letter now saying that my instructions would follow, and unfortunately, I suppose the war, because we had hectic stuck out on the Nab. We saw all the bombardments of Portsmouth and all around the south coast, the island, and I suppose it affected my nervous system, and at the end of the war I was only too pleased to have the opportunity of being pensioned off, which was at the present time over 51 years ago.
So on the Nab, when you were there, what was the equipment you had?
The equipment then was Gardner engines, and it was a revolving lens. The fog signal had a character of its own, and we also had a bell which went about every, well, less than a minute, I think. The bell used to. So that in foggy weather, it was quite a din going on. And I had to wind up. It was a clockwork. I had to wind up the clock, if I remember. Of course, we had a battery room in the engine room. I think there were 3 Gardner engines. We had to maintain them. We had to decarbonise them every so often, take the cylinder head off and clean it all out and so on. The battery room adjoined the engine room, and in the engine room, of course, they had a switchboard with the instruments and the scale, the rheostat, and when you started charging the batteries, and I think there was about a couple of dozen of quite big batteries, which we used to be charging. We used to charge the batteries for the. We had we were in our infancy then of the radio beacon. We had the radio beacon there, and that had a character of its own. If I remember, it was I've forgotten what the character. Of course, we had no in those days. We had no refrigerators or freezers or anything like that. All we had to keep our provisions was just inside of the crane, it's away from the crane deck, which was the deck below the first deck down from the top. A container which we used to say was like a rabbit hutch. It was a square box with perforated zinc round it, and when we used to come off on relief, we used to bring off a joint of meat and some shin of beef that we used to cook and put into jam jars and seal it down with mutton fat, and that we used to put that in the what we called the rabbit box, and that used to last us a week or two, and of course the first jar that we opened used to be quite fresh, but towards the end, when you took the fat off, it used to be quite rich. But we got by. That was, and our only exercise was up on the top deck. I remember distinctly that we could walk in a direct line without an obstruction of 16 paces. 16 paces, then you had there was some obstruction, even if it was only just a batten there, we had to walk over, and we could walk across to the other side of the tower. Well, on the relief, when we were relieved, we used to come alongside and alongside of the landing, and the keepers that were already on the Nab, who one or at least one would be waiting to be relieved, lowered a ladder on supported by 2 ropes. We used to call it the apple picker's ladder because it was a frail thing, and they used to sling the ropes over the girders that surrounded the tower, and as the boat came in round, the bosun would say no, and then you had to jump then to grab hold as high up the ladder as you could, and then of course by the time you grabbed hold of that, the boat had come away from under, and you climbed up. I don't think anybody ever missed, although there was one occasion when we had a mechanic came. No, it wasn't a mechanic, it was a gentleman by the name of Roach. He was, he worked for Marconi. That was to do with the radio beacon, and I think it was his first trip over off to the Nab, and of course he was told to do the same as the regular keepers. That when they came around, when I say jump, you jump, or grab hold of the ladder, and of course Mr. Roach, he was a little bit late in, and he missed his grip, and he dropped into. Of course, the boat had to pull out quick, and he dropped into the water, and there was quite a schmozzle on before they actually got him out. But he was none the worse for his ducking, but he was kept pretty quiet for a while.
Can you tell us about the time you got strafed on the Nab? You know, with the enemies coming.
Oh yes, yes. At that occasion, it was during the war. I was on duty. It was in the middle of the morning, and I was out on the crane deck, and a small convoy of vessels it was just coming in towards Portsmouth, and there was planes circling round that in support of the convoy, and at the tail end I happened to look at one plane, and he was acting a bit strangely, different to what the other planes were doing. And as I watched, now by this time the convoy was about a mile away, I suppose, or half a mile, and this plane circled round, and to my amazement, all I could see of this plane was a thin line with the propeller in the middle, and I saw tracers leave it. It started firing. I thought to myself, well, that's unusual. I didn't have time to do anything except to turn around, and I threw myself down on the ground. Fortunately, it was inside of the crane deck, and as I landed, no sooner had I landed, my backside was going in and out like this, and it was like hell let loose. Cannon shells was big firing, and well, it was only a matter of seconds. You couldn't call it minutes before it was all over, and I got up and somebody said, well, I'm alive, what's happened? And I went out onto the crane deck, and by the side of the doorway there was a hole about 2 inches across, which would been more or less close to where I would have been standing when I see the tracers leave. And just inside where I was laying down on the ground, by the side, there was a roll of cork, I think they called it corkicine. It was like linoleum, thick stuff that the dockies had sent off to put down in their side of the. And well, it was about 3 feet, 2 to 3 feet across diameter. And the head of the cannon shell that hit just outside had gone right through the metal of the tower, and was found later halfway through the roll of lino, and there was a hole like that right the way through the lino, and I was like laying down the side of it. So I considered that I was very lucky. I was luckier than. At the time we had the dockyard workers there, and on the deck below the crane deck there was an open deck right the way round, and one of the dockyard chaps was stood there, and he probably saw what I did, and he tried to hide behind a tank that was there. He tried to hide behind that, but one of the cannon shells hit the tower and exploded. Of course, he's out in the open. He got the full force of that. his head, and of course they found him, and they brought him up, and they sent ashore, and he was dead before they could do anything about it. That was the worst. That was the worst episode that I experienced there. And of course, I suppose things like that affected me. That as soon as the war was over, the emotion began to take over, and I came ashore sick, and eventually they said that, I don't know how they worded it, something that the condition that I was in, I was unable to carry on with my duties, and that state would continue, or something like that. And they just pensioned me off. That was a long time ago.
Now, you were saying something about having to write in and request your pension.
Oh, yes, that was very strange. When they informed me that I'd been pensioned off, which was the conditions of the service, they said that I could either collect my pension at the Trinity Wharf, East Cowes, or apply for it by letter, and they would send. That continued for quite a while, and there were a lot of variations of conditions. There were, I remember, little amounts were added, subject to your financial situation, and it was up to Trinity House to whether they continued that or not. But of course, eventually, these things were sort of consolidated in the pension, and eventually it came that they sent a money order once a month. And then, of course, as time went on, they allowed you to do it, to put it into your bank account. And, of course, every year they used to write once a year to get some verification that I was the person that was drawing the amount. And that's how it happened.
When you joined, what was the wages like?
Well, to our mind, it was average. But I found a copy of the. Perhaps Brian, perhaps you read it out.
You want me to read it out?
Yeah, that was a list that I made at the time. It's recently come to light.
Scale of pay from the 1st of July 1934. Supernumerary keepers, unqualified. Monthly rate £7 1 and threepence. Yearly rate £84 15 shillings. When qualified, the monthly rate went up to £8 4 and 6, and the yearly rate to £98 14 shillings. And then when you were qualified, then when you became AK, under 2 years service, the yearly rate was £98 14 shillings.
Yeah.
The same, that's right. After 2 years it went up to £101, and it gradually went up to 18 years AK, received £133 9 shillings.
That's a year.
Yes. Then principal keepers under 2 years service, monthly rate £12 3 and 5 pence, yearly rate £146 1 shilling. After 2 years, monthly rate £12 6 and 7, yearly rate £147 19 shillings. Then up to 4 years and above, monthly rate £12 13 shillings, yearly rate £151 16 shillings.
So what was I drawing after 12 years?
After 12 years,
I
you were on £117 5 shillings a year.
and I brought a family up on that. And this is one of them. This is Brian, my youngest son, and Robert is the elder one.
So how many?
I've got 2 boys, and
Both retired.
both retired now. Yes.
Now you had relatives that were. Keepers.
Yes, my brother. There's Gisli coming up the road. My brother, I suppose he was responsible for me joining, really. He joined in 1920, and he got married. The conditions then was that you couldn't be married as a supernumerary. You had to wait until you were appointed before you could get married. And of course the average time of a supernumerary normally would have been about 3 years. But after the war, after the First World War this is, the time went up to about 7 years as a supernumerary, and my brother was one that joined in 1920, just after the First World War, and he went 7 years before he was able to get married officially, but he got married unofficially after about 3 or 4 years. In fact, he had their first baby, well, their only child, during that time, but he had to keep it quiet until he became appointed, and he had to go through a ceremony again to satisfy Trinity House that he was qualified enough to. And it was, of course, it was during that time, 1928, well, it was probably 1927 that he was appointed to the city bishop, and of course they had to move to St Mary's, City Isles, and it was during that time that my sister-in-law went off to the bishop. I don't know what conveyance she had to get there, but she went aboard the lighthouse and went up on the British Buoy, and of course came back the same way. And I've got a photograph of her. You've seen the photograph of her coming down, being lowered from the. I don't know who the keeper was, apart from my brother. And that he was there until that would have been 1928, and his next appointment was to the Needles. He came back to the island, and it was from the Needles that he got fed up with the job and came out of it, and started up on some other means of livelihood, and that would have been about the same year that I joined, at 1934 or 1935, and he hadn't been out of the job, out of the service long, before he had a motorcycle accident on the island and lost his leg. And during the Second World War, he worked for Soldiers' Row in the office, and of course he's dead and gone now. He'd been dead some years. Yeah, he'd been dead here when Glenn, my grandson, was born. It was 1975, so he's been dead 12 years.
22.
22? 22 years, yeah, 22 years. 22 years.
How about Uncle Bill?
Oh, Uncle Bill, I met him first.
Bill
Of course, he wasn't my uncle. Not. I did holiday duty at Hartland Point as a supernumerary in 1935. Well, it was early, during the 3 years that I was a super. And he was one of the keepers. Bill Halil was the junior. No, he was the senior assistant. Frank
Davis.
Frank Davis and Tommy Roberts was the PK. And I arrived for holiday duty, I remember. I had to get a taxi from Bideford, where I arrived at, and I didn't get to the lighthouse until it was approaching midnight. And the keeper that was on watch when I got there was Mr. Halil, who eventually became uncle by marriage. And well, at 12 o'clock, of course, he had to be relieved, and Tommy Roberts came down, and I was introduced, and I arrived unexpectedly. They didn't even know that they were starting their leave, and they were quite annoyed that they hadn't been informed that a super was coming to effect their relief. And of course I was there for the 9 weeks, and during that time of course I realised that Bill Halil was an Isle of Wight chap, and of course we had something in common, and I was he said, when you go back to the island, you'll have to look up the family at Knighton, which I did, and that's when I've met his niece, which eventually became my wife. And well, within a period of time we were married when I got my appointment, and had 2 boys. Bob, he was born at East Cowes, and we stayed there until we were bombed out when Cowes was had heavily bombardment one night. We were bombed out. My other son, Brian, he was on the way.
And you were home on leave?
And I was on leave, so we moved out pronto to stay at Knighton, where we eventually got a place.
What was your wife's name?
Well, her name was Petchy, Joan Petchy. unfortunately, I lost her. She had a stroke in
73.
1972.
1972,
Yeah.
and she died in
She had,
83.
she had another one in 83.
Yeah. So of course, meanwhile, of course, Bob, my eldest son, he married and got a son, and Brian, who remained with us, has been my mainstay ever since. Since the wife died. And of course, each year I'm getting a little bit older and depending a little more on the family.
Can you go back to after you did your training and run through some of the lighthouses you went to?
Oh yes, yes. Well, my first lighthouse was Pendine. When I left, that would have been in
1934 you went there.
1934.
That was on completion of the training.
That's right. After I
Trinity
completed my training, I went to Pendine, and then that's right. I went to Pendine, got the certificate for number one certificate. Anyway, I passed me that. I was there for a number of weeks.
Number 4A certificate.
4A, yes. And then I had orders to go to Penzance, and my next move would have been to have gone off to the wharf. And while I was at the wharf, I met one of the supernumeraries there. What was his name? Anyway, he was a residential supernumerary for the district, and I had orders to go off to the wharf and given instructions from the superintendent. And this chap, I'll find his name in a minute. But anyway, he said, "Oh, you'll be all right there." He says, "I've been off there quite a few times." He says, "and you'll be all right." He says, "I'll advise you what provisions and that to get and that." So he came round to the stores and got what I had to.
Frank Lock.
That's right. And got the stuff, and I got my suitcase, which I carried my bits and pieces in, and stored it all in one of the harness. They used to use harness casks. I think they call them harness casks, like big barrels. And everything was put in there, and I was due to go off the next day. And Frank Locke, he said, "Oh, you'll be all right," and that. Well, anyway, to cut a long story short, the next morning when I went down to start off to go off, the orders were changed. That they cancelled me going off, and Frank Locke had to go instead. And he was furious about it, of course. You can quite understand. Oh, you said, I've spent 18 months there already. And of course, I had to unpack all my stuff. And anyway, he was quite decent about it. He helped me out. I let him have my provisions and that, but I had to sort out my bits and pieces and repack my... Well, anyway, that was that. And I was sent then from... instead of going back to Pendine, I went to Start Point. and I got my radio beacon certificate there, and I was there for a number of weeks, and the keepers there was, if I remember rightly, was Clegg. Clegg was the principal keeper. Norman Page was the senior assistant, and Arthur Godfrey was the junior assistant. Now Arthur Page, he had done duty on the Falkland Islands, and while I was there, it was during the holiday season, and the two keepers, they didn't see eye to eye all, and they used to argue about the slightest thing. In fact, on one occasion, I remember seeing them stood out in the yard, raising their fists to each other. But everything went off all right, and I went from there to where did I go from there?
Went back to Blackwall.
I went to Blackwall then, and then
On to Anvil Point for 3 weeks holiday.
that's
duty.
right. Yes, I went to Anvil Point.
Sugar Point.
I went to Suter Point. That's right, and it was at Suter. I was at Suter Point for 7 months, and the keepers there was Bill Kay, George Maskell, and Reg Rashley. They were the three keepers, and I was there for 7 months doing holiday duty, sick duty, and winter duty. And during that time, Bill Kay, he retired after doing his full time, and the keeper that relieved Bill Kay was
Hambling.
that's right, Rocky Hambling, and he was getting on, but referring back to the Bill Kay, I always remember he was from the Scilly Islands originally, and he was still corresponding with his mother, although he was in his 60s. It amazed me at the time that he had a mother alive when he was there coming up to 60. And of course I used to have long talks with Mr. Kay, and he, during his time, they had the bobtail coat, and his stature was such that he had rather short legs, but his body was the normal length, the normal sized body, but his legs, so it made him look shorter than he would have done if it had normal sized legs. But what used to amuse us was the story that went around that when they used to wear the bobtail coats, that his bobtail used to drag along the ground, and it used to be a source of amusement. Whether that was true or not, I don't know. But he was a very nice chap. And of course, George Maskell, who was the senior assistant, he had two daughters, Grace and Edie, who eventually married a policeman, Ainsworth, named Ainsworth. And yeah, that's right, yes, George, I did meet him again until I was appointed to the Nab, and he became PK at the Needles during that time. And of course, I had to, when I was appointed, I had to find accommodation while I was ashore, and I happened to be ashore, or George Massey happened to be ashore, and I knew that he lived at West Cowes, and I lodged with him, from 1937 for nearly 12 months, and meanwhile, of course, I met and married my wife, and we set up home at East Cowes, and I took over the bungalow. No, it wasn't a bungalow, was it? The house from the principal keeper of the Nab, Jimmy Stone, who was due to retire. As he retired, we stepped in, and we lived there for 5 years until we were bombed out in 1942.
May 1942.
42. As I say, Brian was on the way then, Bob was 3.5, and of course that night that we were bombed, Cowes had a pasting of it, and the first wave that came over dropped incendiary bombs, and the street opposite to where I lived in Adelaide Grove, Minerva Road, was a terrace of houses down, and every one of those houses had a stick of incendiary bombs settled on them, and they all set fire. And the last one of that stick of that series of landed on the pavement outside of our place. And I remember we always had to keep a bucket of sand and a shovel outside in case of incidents like that. But of course, like everything else, it's been neglected. It's been there for some time. When I went out to shovel it, the sand was solid, and the incendiary bomb was hissing away. So I immediately picked the bucket up and put the whole lot on, left the bucket there. I don't know what happened to that. And of course, it wasn't long then. We were fortunate, wife and I, and Bob. Our neighbour had an underground shelter. We just got in there in time when everything started. Well, halfway through the night's bombing, there was a lull, and we thought it was all over. And we shared the airway shelter with a neighbour, and we said, well, shall we go and have a look round and see what damage has been done? So we agreed, and this chap was, well, he must have been close on 60, and we wandered on down and could see what damage had been done, and went along the Arbour Road towards the centre of the place, the town, and by this time the people that try to do their best.
Air raid wardens?
No,
welfare
people were in operation, and one had a car giving drinks and that, and there were several people at a time, and I was the last one to have a cup of coffee or something. But before I could drink it, bombing started again. And we were in the centre of it. And, well, we didn't have time to say anything. We just dropped the cup and we ran like cats with their heads off, really. We didn't know what to do. But anyway, we followed one or two others, and there was some fencing, chestnut fencing along, which was about that high. We cleared that, and as I say, this chap must have been 60. How we got over it, and we got round to this shelter, just as they were going to close it, and we said, we want to get in. They said there isn't any room. But as they said that, something dropped, and they must have pressed us in there, and we stayed for another hour or two, and of course both of us were concerned as to what was happening at home. We didn't know what was going to happen, and anyway, after we really. What saved cows on that occasion was there was a Polish destroyer. I've forgotten the name of it. Each year it's commemorated that they saved cows. They were pumping up the air all the time. And anyway, when we thought it was all over, we came out and walked along Yarborough Road, and where the van was, that was pushed up against the wall. We never knew what happened to the lady that was driving it. And right the way along the shop, there was several shops, flames, and that you could see through the open windows. The sweet shop, I remember seeing the jars of sweets still on there. It was really eerie, and of course we couldn't get back home quick enough, which was about 5 to 10 minutes walk, and flames all the way along. But when we got to our place, it was just as we'd left it. And of course they were thankful to us when we got it in there. And of course the next day, potholes, there bomb holes everywhere. But they were able to run a service that came from a bus service from Newport. No conductors or anything. We just bundled in and left. And there was a hole right up through our roof. And well, we just left it. I think we were able to lock the door. And we went to got in the bus and went to Newport, and I got a taxi from there out to Knighton to where my wife's family